Hi everybody, my name is Peter Laws and this is the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I explore the deeper and sometimes spiritual themes of horror films. Now this week, Arrow Video in the UK are releasing the first 3 Hellraiser movies in a luxurious box set with the cool title, The Scarlet Box. Now I was lucky enough to get my hands on a copy last week, and so join me as I share my thoughts on Clive Barker's Hellraiser.
We'll tear your soul apart.
Now, Hellraiser came out in 1987, that was almost 30 years ago, which means that this was the year that Dirty Dancing came out and RoboCop. On TV, Star Trek The Next Generation had just started, as had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Ronald Reagan was still president in the US, and over here we still had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. I mention these little cultural signposts because it helps give you an idea of the landscape this movie bubbled up into. You see, in 1987, horror films already had a strong and well-established collection of horror icons. Freddy Krueger was well established by then, pretty much. In fact, the third Elm Street film, Dream Warriors, was released that very year. Michael Myers, by that point, had only starred in 2 horror films, Halloween 1 and Halloween 2, naturally, but he was still a key horror symbol, so much so that people were so taken with him that when Part 3 was released without him, there was uproar. He'd return, thanks to popular demand, in Part 4 in 1988. In contrast to Freddy and Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees was really in his stride by 87. They were already up to Part 6, Jason Lives, with the new blood following the next year. In other words, what I'm saying is the horror world already had an established fright pack of iconic monsters. The Universal years had its icons, Hammer had their icons, and now in the 1980s there was this modern set of key horror characters. And it was into this when Pinhead strode in amongst them all, courtesy of New World Pictures, and when he turned up, he instantly stood out. It wasn't just because he was wearing a leather skirt either. In fact, he was so unique that you could almost imagine Freddy and Michael and Jason and the clan, you know, pausing from a murder just to eye each other up and thinking, who the heck is this new guy? There was just something very different about this new addition to the horror star fraternity. For example, Michael Myers was a silent, wordless shape. He was stripped of expression and distinguishing features. And of course, this was and is Michael Myers' strength. But Pinhead, on the other hand, went for a different approach altogether. He was erudite and talkative. He might not just kill someone, but he might ruminate on the philosophy of it. And not only that, Pinhead seemed to have an ambitious mission statement in life, far more expansive than Jason, Freddy, and Michael Myers. Those guys were fueled, like many of the slashers were, by a sort of personal revenge ethic. They'd been slighted in the past and they wanted to spend the rest of their lives seeking vengeance on a particular group of people, and sometimes doing it at a particular time of year. There was something very Judeo-Christian about this approach to law-breaking and justice, you know, or rather the idea that, you know, if someone does something bad, then punishment is coming. The slasher movies fed into this sort of storyline, and we loved them for it, and we still do. Pinhead, on the other hand, had a much wider mission focus. He wasn't about seeking revenge. For him, his horror was prompted by the relentless quest for personal experience. Pinhead wasn't so much out to hurt people who'd slighted him in the past. He was just a man who wanted to discover the powers of forbidden knowledge, the extremes of pleasure and pain. I think there's something Lovecraftian about him in that way. About him seeking deeper esoteric knowledge. And there's also something that reminds me of people like Aleister Crowley too, and other occultists, people who choose the left-hand path to deepen experience. But equally, I'd even say that Pinhead's self-discovery ethic reminds me a little bit of Oprah Winfrey as well. You know, like the spiritual movement to the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, that sense of personal discovery, of tapping into power. I don't think it's no surprise that Pinhead came along in the midst of that. He just wants to do self-discovery through chains and splayed skin. Actually, as an aside, I suppose technically speaking, we should call Pinhead Nailhead, since the extras on the new Arrow release make it clear that pins do not show up well on camera, and so the effects guys had to make it with nails instead. But calling him Nailhead sounds a bit dumb, sounds like a character from Class of Nukem High, so let's stick with Pinhead. So, Pinhead also stood out from Jason Voorhees too. I mean, Jason loped about in his scruffy work boots. He's like the quintessential blue-collar horror icon, which is great. But then in walks this posh, elegant, fashionable Cenobite who you half expected to have polished every nail on his head before a hard day's pleasure-seeking. Jason, on the other hand, to be honest, sometimes you're thinking that the last time Jason Voorhees ever took a bath was probably when he drowned as a kid. So Pinhead was hugely different to Jason and Michael Myers, and you can almost imagine the three of them having a conversation, you know, like, "Jason, I have such sights to show you," and Jason be like, "Huh?" Then of course there's Freddy Krueger, who certainly spoke a lot, too much in fact, especially as the Elm Street franchise rolled on. Freddy's dialogue and grubby tongue waggling may have made audiences laugh and enjoy it, but the stuff he came out with was just so often infantile and low grade compared to this kinky, sophisticate, this stereotypical English monster. Not only that, Pinhead and his fellow Cenobites were scary too. They were unpredictable. They were like vampires in the sense that they only came to your house if you invited them. And the method of invitation was fiddling around with a Terry's chocolate orange sort of Rubik's Cube thing. I do like the idea that Clive Barker chose a puzzle box to become the doorway to hell. Remember, this was the smartphone-free 80s. Handheld puzzles were huge back then. I remember how for a while each Christmas I was given some variation on a Rubik's Cube or other handheld puzzle device, and I wonder if Clive Barker had just had too many hours trying to crack the Rubik's configuration and decided that it was clearly the portal to a torturous underworld. Anyway, once you do crack it, Pinhead comes swooping in, arching his fingers all regal-like, and then he'd be booming out thoughtful but chilling dialogue about pleasure being pretty much indistinguishable from pain. And of course he wasn't alone. He brings along with him this crazy entourage of fellow Cenobites who leer and chatter into the camera with metal wires pulling back flesh as their internal parts are exposed, and it's not just for torture, but it's for art, it's for expression. Now, this sort of body modification shocked and even bewildered, I think, many audiences back in 1987. These days, you can turn on the TV and you can see a gaggle of people showing how they want to modify and alter their own bodies. It's not really that much of a big deal. For example, the recent thing seems to be putting a circular hole in your cheek so that you can see the teeth through it and you poke your tongue out through it. This sort of stuff might make people squeal a little bit and giggle, but we know it's out there. It's the fodder for YouTube videos and reality TV shows. In some ways, it's not that big of a deal. Back in 1987, though, this idea of extreme piercing and splayed flesh was strange, new, and scary. Especially because audiences started to realize that it reflected a real community of body modifiers who may not have reached the mainstream yet, but they were certainly real. They were certainly out there. So when Pinhead entered this horror frame in the first Hellraiser film, I think we saw something powerful and new and quite unsettling for many people. It was something that messed with people's heads a bit, which all great horror should. However, in time, the sequel machine would gradually do what it tended to do to many of the horror icons. We'd see Pinhead becoming domesticated, or rather predictable, and therefore less scary. That's not to say he lost his attraction altogether. There's stacks of horror fans who absolutely love and adore the Hellraiser films and their sequels and the franchise. And the character of Pinhead and the other Cenobites are a massive part of that, particularly with the sequels. Yet for me, speaking frankly, the more Pinhead we saw, the less interested I tended to get. It's probably no surprise then to find that my opinions on Hellraiser are perhaps quite predictable. Basically, I like the first one the best. That movie, directed by Clive Barker himself, might have lost a little of its power with age, but it still retains a sense of edgy danger and threat, which made it such a standout piece of horror back in the 80s. It's the story of the repressed English housewife who will go to any lengths to fuel her twisted romance with a skinless, greedy corpse that she's keeping up in the attic. In this first film, Pinhead works brilliantly because he floats on the edges of the story He's certainly a vital figure in the film, and he was definitely, in fact, the star of the marketing campaign. But he doesn't feel like the pin-up boy within the movie itself. Instead, he's in the shadows, he's fueling the film's power, and I find that Pinhead and the fellow Cenobites are all the more scary because of that distance. The characters in the film are great too. I always felt a little sorry for Larry, played by Andrew Robinson. Now, Robinson was perfect in Dirty Harry as the psycho killer Scorpio. Here, he's just playing an average guy trying to have a nice house and a car and a pretty straightforward marriage. In the world of Hellraiser, however, this sort of vanilla ambition in life is seen as pathetic. He's like part of the zombie world. Humans that have no desire to step out of their norms are to be disdained. He's presented as immaterial to the story, and he could only possibly gain notoriety if he could be absorbed into the epic world of the Cenobites. It's an interesting approach. It makes sense for the film, but I still felt kind of sorry for this guy who just wanted to have an average life. Frank, the charismatic brother, looks like he's just stepped off a 1980s Levi's ad, but he does play the dangerous antithesis of his brother Larry well, who has this interest in puzzle boxes and scary esoteric adventures. It's not a shock then to find that Julia is far more excited by Frank than Larry, her husband. Funnily enough, I always found Julia herself to be one of the scariest things about the original Hellraiser. She is brilliantly played by Claire Higgins. And she seems so fixed on her love for Frank and her desire for fulfillment that she's going to be willing to do anything to make that happen. And the scenes where she does whatever it takes to secure Frank's love always creeped me out, because she plays the murderer with a strange sense of vulnerability mixed with pure evil. And I think it's uncanny. It's an uncanny balancing act, which really struck me when I first saw it, and it did on my rewatch last week. At times she looks like an 80s pop goddess. She's odd too though. You can't decide if she's beautiful or hideous. She draws you in, but you never would ever want to meet her. I think Claire Higgins' performance as Julia is one of the strongest elements of Hellraiser, and I would argue one of the reasons why the film still stands out so strongly today. Oh, and being thick, I hadn't even realised that Frank was played by two different people in the film. Sean Chapman plays the human debonair Frank, but the skinless version was played by a different actor called Oliver Smith. So it's good to learn in the Arrow extras that, you know, there's these two guys. I think Smith adds a good sense of sly menace to the character Frank, and hats off to him for enduring that grueling makeup. And of course it goes without saying that Doug Bradley as Pinhead is fantastic. I mean, he really nails... Wow, I just said that wasn't even on purpose, but he really nails this part. He really gets it right. I also want to mention Christopher Young's score, which I think adds vital texture to the story. It's a sweeping orchestral soundtrack that makes the film feel exotic and expansive. I've heard the music that was originally intended for Hellraiser by the band Coil, and I think the music's great by Coil, and I think their industrial sound would have worked very well for the film. But there is something about Christopher Young's symphonic approach that I do think makes the horror of Hellraiser feel a lot more epic and wide-ranging. Remember, Pinhead's ambitions in life are more than just seeking small-scale revenge on people who've slighted him. I think the Christopher Young score reflects that gravity of this world that's opening up. Having said that, though, the film isn't perfect, and I think it is possible to nitpick Hellraiser if you want to. For example, sometimes the regrowth cycle of Frank seems a bit inconsistent. Like a few drops of blood at the beginning seem to be able to rebuild him from a heart into an almost fully formed human, but it takes buckets and buckets of this stuff to get him past the level to the next and then to the next. I'll discuss the effects a bit more in a moment. But also in the film, which has some weighty philosophical dialogue, some of the lines feel out of place. The whole "come to daddy" stuff, for example, felt a bit ropey to me. And there's moments where Hellraiser 1 and 2 even reminded me of Superman 2. You know, there's scenes in that film where three otherworldly menaces turn up dressed in black. One with the commanding English accent General Zod bargaining with humans to find the son of Jor-El. Here we get similar scenes with these Cenobites walking in black, you know, bargaining with Larry's daughter to help find Frank. But these are minor niggles, and besides, I love Superman too. The original Hellraiser, I think, is still a powerful work of British horror, and it shocked and unsettled people at the time. And I would say, watching it again, it does still retain some of that quite a lot of that unique sense of threat today.
Hellbound. Hellraiser 2. Time to play.
Now, the healthy box office for Hellraiser 2 led to an inevitable sequel, Hellraiser Hellbound. It isn't quite as solid as the original, but it's got enough interesting ideas and imagery, I think, to warrant at least its existence. Here, Pinhead and his pals are taking things a step further than the first film, and they're letting us see the delights and terrors of hell itself. Turns out that hell isn't so much fire and brimstone, it's actually weirdly ordered and geometric. I think it looks like a sort of demonic IKEA. The film is a bit silly in places, and it has that misty camera sheen of late 80s like TV shows like Dempsey and Makepeace or something, which put me off. But it's inventive at times, and it's even a little creepy too. The scenes with Julia and her bandages are both surreal and scary, though I did find that Julia gets way too obsessed with like licking people's fingers. I'm sure she does it like multiple times in the film. Gradually, we start to see some of the sillier dialogue creeping into the franchise in part 2. The whole "nothing personal, babe" and "the doctor is in." These sorts of wisecracks might sound funny to some viewers, but they're like the one-liners Freddy Krueger started to say in Elm Street franchise, which always, I'm sorry, it just made me groan. In fact, the whole horror icons making a wisecrack after killing someone was way too similar to what action films were doing at the time. You know, Schwarzenegger drilling someone to death while shouting, "Screw you!" or like throwing, like, "Need a light," and throwing a match on someone who was covered in petrol. Seeing that sort of smart aleck dialogue in horror just always felt a bit embarrassing to me. Still though, there's some interesting ideas in Hellbound, and it's good to see Pinhead getting a backstory that actually does add something to the film, rather than just some tokenist addition. By part 3 though, things start to take a clearer downturn.
It's so good to be back. Clive Barker presents Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth.
In Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, Pinhead is now wedged into a wooden column, and he's being shipped to the US, Blackula style. Or rather, it's probably more like when the Amityville curse got downloaded into a floor lamp a few years earlier. You know, when the producers wanted to get the Amityville like horror to be going into different locations. Now, Pinhead is like a talking door knocker barking out "kill for me" instructions to an actor who I was sure was Marky Mark from the Funky Bunch at the time. Anyway, he wasn't, but he looked like him. Anyway, I know plenty of people who love part 3 who keep getting a kick out of the deepening story of Hellraiser, but for me, 3 marked the beginning of fatal fatigue with the wisecracks and the religious melodrama.
Ready for your close-up?
That's not to say the Hellraiser franchise became a waste of time. As such, you know, they've got moments of merit, and like I said, they have hordes of fans, so they're doing something right in a way. But all I'm saying is that for me, Arrow's lovingly produced release is like a subtle case study in the gradual commodification of new horror visions. In 1987, Pinhead was this fearsome new guy in horror. But only a few years later, it's all it took for this nightmare new man to become like a wisecracking pseudo anti-hero. He might make us want to punch the air and chuckle in the sequels now and again. But when he first appeared, he made the air feel like it might choke us. The change isn't a problem for many audiences, but to me, it's a trajectory worth noting at least. Still though, unlike Freddy Krueger, at least Pinhead had the good sense not to do a single with the Fat Boys. You know, seeing Pinhead struggle to keep his headphones on while he's like mixing up the muffins would have like, that would have been a level of pain I think even the most hardened Cenobite would struggle to find the pleasure in. Well, the package that Arrow put together for these 3 films is really quite epic. I mean, it's stuffed with extras and special features, and I reckon it explores everything you'd ever want to know about the first 3 Hellraiser films. Plus, it all comes in a sumptuous box set that you'll probably be poring over for ages. Arrow have also released these films in remastered prints. And there are a few grain problems at times, but it's a vibrant picture, it's well handled on the whole. In fact, the added detail of HD shows up some of the limitations of the practical effects here and there. The films do feel dated in that way. I remember seeing these films for the first time and thinking that part 1 and part 2 in particular had effects that were, I felt like they were on a constant level of awesome. Watching it back on Blu Ray, there's times when you can clearly see the latex and the animatronics, and also there's a few occasional moments of animation which really shows the age of the film. It's not a problem as such, and it's not to be held against a film that's almost 30 years old, but it's still there. And besides, many of the effects still hold up well. Like in the original Hellraiser, where we get the resurrection of Frank, that sequence, this was an additional reshoot prompted by the guys at New World because they wanted to pump more money into the film. And yeah, that moment is animatronics and it's reverse photography, but it's still a pretty exhilarating scene. And on the whole, I still, as well, squirm at that genius moment in part 1 where a sex scene is intercut with Larry gradually moving towards a nail on the wall and he cuts his hand on it. That is an inspired, deranged scene. It's really good. You know, the legacy of Hellraiser lives on today, not only in popular culture, but it even lives on public transport. Yeah, there's a public bus shelter in London which has been mysteriously haunted for a few years now by a VHS copy of Hellraiser. What's more, the tape has been joined by other tapes as well of Hellraiser, including even Hellbound, the sequel. It's like it's an unofficial shrine to this film. It makes sense that the film should linger in the imagination because it certainly did push audiences towards a fresh angle of horror back in 1987. But like much that is new and novel, in time it became little more than sequel fodder. No matter though, just because that is the case, it doesn't detract from the fact that Hellraiser is a fascinating British horror film. A product of its time perhaps, but judging by the response to this new box set, Pinhead is still grabbing people and showing them new sights and dragging them along with him, even now, nearly 30 years later. Well, that's it for the Flicks the Church Forgot. Thanks for watching or listening, or however you're consuming this. Do visit my website, theflicksthechurchforgot.com, or subscribe to me on YouTube, or to the podcast through iTunes and other places. Follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws, and find me on Facebook at The Flicks the Church Forgot. Oh, and you can also read my monthly horror column in the Fortune Times magazine. But until next time, dig out your old Rubik's Cube and peel off the stickers, because you never know, you might find gold underneath, and you may even find the portal to the pleasures and pain of hell. But while you're trying to figure that out, because it's a hard configuration, do one thing for me. Don't forget, the Flicks the Church Forgot.